Excuse me while I just get the recording down correctly. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I don't know why everyone is here. I'm glad you're here, but I'd like to explain a little bit of why I'm here tonight. It's an important issue that faces not only Hanover Township, but a lot of suburban towns, and that is the issue of the proliferation of multifamily housing. Many of you moved to Hanover Township, or some of you were born in Hanover Township, but one of the things that many of you enjoy about a suburban municipality like Hanover Township is its quality of life and its low density of housing. If you wanted to live in the city, you'd move to the city. But we've seen a trend towards more multifamily housing, not only in Hanover, but in many suburban municipalities. It's become an issue of some controversy. A lot of towns fear the loss of their suburban character. They fear an influx of students into their schools. They fear the additional traffic. And they fear other things that comes along with the higher density type housing. There's a lot at play here. And hopefully tonight I will explain the forces that have caused and will continue to cause this push for multifamily in Hanover Township. Those causes fall into one of two categories. Firstly, there's demographic and economic changes that are at play and have been at play for a number of years that are causing an increased demand for multifamily housing. The second one is the state of New Jersey's affordable housing policy, which has also been ongoing for a number of decades. So I hope everyone is here for that reason, to learn about that. If not, I hope you'll learn something that was unexpected. Okay. 1979, there was 27 multifamily housing units in Hanover Township. As of today, there's over 1,800 multifamily housing units in Hanover Township, and there's more planned. That's a significant jump. It's a greater jump on a percentage basis than single family. It may be a greater jump even than on a pure number basis than single family over that same time period. It's not unique to Hanover Township. You look at the statistic I've given there. I've given for both New Jersey and for Morris County. Change by percentage, net change that is, since 1980 by type of housing. In the left column, you'll see that for New Jersey, the change since 1980 is comprised, 16.9 of that is single-family housing. Over 80%, 83+% in New Jersey is not single-family housing. That's the net growth since 1980. Same in Morris County. Little less multifamily, but not far. 26.6% of that change since 1980 was for single-family housing. Over 73% was for housing other than single-family. That includes multifamily and some other housing. Part of it boils down to how you define multifamily housing. That can include 2-family, 3-family, townhouses, condominiums, apartments, both rental and for sale type of housing. But it's not a single home on its own lot. And that's what is happening throughout the state of New Jersey and Morris County. So it's a big issue. So I'd like to talk about the first of the two factors I mentioned before, and that is the impact of both demographic and economic changes on the housing market and why that's resulting in more multifamily housing. You can see the quote from the Rutgers Regional Report. A tsunami of demographic and economic forces has redefined the demand for rental housing in New Jersey. Number of items here. First is the aging of the baby boomer generation. The baby boomers are those who were born after the Second World War from 1946 up to 1964. They represented a very large proportion of the population, more than they would have normally been. And there's a number of reasons for that. We don't have to go into that, but it partly had to do with the Depression and the war and people delaying having children. It also had something to do with economic prosperity after the war in the 50s and 60s. And so what that generation had a lot of kids, more than the generation before it, more than the generation after it. As that generation has aged over time, they've affected the housing market in a number of ways. They are reaching the age now, and I'm part of that generation, a lot of us are here, is their housing choice as they get closer to retirement or as they've reached retirement in some people's cases. They're looking to downsize, they're looking to simplify, they don't want the headache of the maintenance, they don't want the cost of the maintenance and the cost of maintaining a home or the inconvenience and having to do all the repairs. And so for many of those, they're choosing alternative types of housing, including multifamily housing, townhouses. We see townhouses that sell for $700,000 or more. Why are people that have that kind of income buying housing? It's not because they can't afford a single-family home. It's because they don't want it. And that's true of many of the baby boomers. There's also the millennial generation. What's the millennial generation? People disagree on the specific time frames, but generally speaking, the millennial generation is that generation in our population that is maturing, reaching their 20s at the time of the new millennium, meaning the 21st century. 2000 and later, they're reaching their 20s. A lot of the millennials are children of the baby boomers. The millennials are also known as echo boomers because they're sort of the echo of the baby boom. And again, as the baby boom generation was more numerous than other generations before and after, since there was more of them, there's more of them to have children. And now those children are reaching an age when they're making housing choices of their own. However, as they're reaching housing choice age, the circumstances are different than it was for the baby boomers on a number of fronts. One is housing costs, other housing choice. When I grew up, when a lot of us grew up, everyone wanted a single-family home. Not necessarily so with millennials, at least not yet. There's a lot of factors behind that, but suffice to say that many in the millennial generation are not looking for a single-family home. They're looking for multifamily. That's affecting housing demand. Foreign immigration. This is one that a lot of people understand that foreign immigration has occurred, but a lot of people don't realize that 1 in 5 New Jersey residents today are foreign-born. 1 in 6 in Hanover Township. That's a significant percentage. That means they were not born in this country. What does that have to do with housing? Well, statistics have shown that the foreign-born rent more than native-born. I have statistics that show that 50% of the foreign-born in New Jersey are renters, whereas only 32% of the native-born are renters. So the influx of foreign immigration, meaning there's more of it, and the housing choice of those who are foreign-born being more aimed towards rental housing, and since multifamily is more commonly rental housing than single-family, that's also driving the push towards more multifamily housing. Changing household characteristics. What do I mean by that? Many of us know about this, but over the last 40 to 50 years, we've seen a number of changes to household characteristics. We've seen an increase of single-person households. We've seen an increase of single-parent households. We've seen an income of non-traditional family households where people are not married and living together. We're seeing other trends, decreased household size. The household size has dropped by almost 1 person per household. Fewer people, don't need as big of a house. Fewer wage earners in the household, can't afford a bigger house. Those are affecting housing choices. And not all, but many of these new household characteristics are affecting a push similarly towards more multifamily and non-single-family type of housing. We're seeing fewer children per household. Again, you don't need so many bedrooms. You don't need the cost. You don't need the maintenance. you're able to live in a non-single family home. Some people do it by choice. Some people do it because of cost. Geographic population shift. This is a fairly recent trend, but in the last 10 years, the population of Sussex, Warren, and Hunterdon counties, those are populations to the west. Also, the more rural populations have declined. Up until that time, they had been increasing. We've seen in the last 8 years now a decline in those three counties. However, if you look at the counties of Bergen, Essex, Hudson, Morris, Somerset, and Union counties, their populations increased. If you look at the state as a whole, its population increased. So what we're seeing are people who are, we used to talk a lot about sprawl and how it was going out into those areas. Now we're actually seeing a retraction of population from those areas. What does that mean for housing? Well, as more people are choosing to live closer to the city and in the suburbs and avoiding the long commute, trying to be closer to their jobs, they're putting pressure on the housing market. There's not as much land available to build single-family housing in the suburban and urban areas. They're largely built up. So the only way providing more housing for them is by building multifamily. So they are affecting the market for multifamily housing. Not all, of course. Some choose single-family, many choose single-family. But they are adding to the population, and the supply and demand factors at play there are adding to the demand for multifamily housing. Changing technologies and job markets. This is an economic trend that we've seen. We all know about the office boom during the 1980s. We couldn't build enough offices at the time. Today, we're seeing high vacancy rates. In a lot of areas, vacancy rates are as high as 20% or more in office buildings. It does vary. The reasons for this, one was overbuilding. They thought that demand would just keep going and going. It didn't happen. But other reasons are behind that office market change. Change in technology. A lot of jobs are being done by computers. They used to be done by clerical staff. A lot of companies have globalized, have combined jobs, merged, acquisitions, and so forth. So now you have 10 people doing the job of 20. That's reduced office jobs. A lot of people are telecommuting from home. Office markets are shrinking as well. We're also seeing rapid changes in the office and other markets as well. When you have a single-family home and your job relocates or your job changes, you do not have the flexibility to go with the new job as easy, because now you've got to sell your house, find a new house to move with the job. Multifamily housing works better in that type of a situation because you can get out of a rental situation much easier than you can out of selling a single-family home. So although there's other factors at work as well, that is contributing to the multifamily housing boom that we've been seeing. The Great Recession. What's the Great Recession? That was the time period, a 4-year period between 2007 and 2010, when we saw a crash in the stock market. We saw housing affected significantly. A lot of housing mortgages failed at that time because banks had overlended and had not had sufficient qualifications to lending. And so a lot of people lost their single-family homes as a result of the Great Recession. Not to mention, there was a huge loss of jobs during that time period. Both of those really impacted the single-family housing market. And a lot of people who are recovering even today from the Great Recession, who lost their homes, are not as eager to jump back into a single-family home situation. Even if they are, getting loans for single-family homes is more difficult than it used to be because banks were forced to change their lending practices to be more restrictive so this wouldn't happen again. We are still seeing a slow economic recovery from the Great Recession. We're much of the way back, but particularly in New Jersey, other parts of the country are different, but New Jersey has lagged behind much of the country in the recovery from the Great Recession. So those are affecting the housing market in that people either can't afford or they're not able or willing to go back into a single-family home situation, either because they lost their job, they lost their assets, they lost their home. They have to rent. They don't have a choice anymore. And once burnt, twice shot. So that is another factor affecting multifamily housing demand, as well as single-family demand. And then high student loan debt. I don't think it's a surprise to any of us to understand, particularly the millennial generation, the high school costs for going to college and the high loans that many of these students carry for years after they graduate from college. We've already spoken about the millennials and their housing choices and their housing needs. They're delaying marriage, they're delaying children. They're able to, until they get established in their careers, they may, as they get older, choose to go for more single-family housing, but at this point in time, they're choosing more multifamily housing because they're not established. They're carrying heavy student loan debt. That's another factor. So they're not able financially, even if they wanted single-family homes, to afford a single-family home on its own lot. So again, I'm speaking in generalities, but what I'm trying to say is not every millennial will do this, but many will. And when you add all of these factors together, you can see that both demographic and economic forces are having a huge effect on multifamily housing demand in Hanover Township, in Morris County, and in the state of New Jersey. I'd like to speak now about affordable housing policy, which is the second half of what's driving this market demand. Not market demand, but what's driving the construction of multifamily housing. You can see here the quote from the Sierra Club. COAH law having a bigger impact on land use and development than any other law in New Jersey's history. That's a pretty extreme statement. Whether it's true or not, I don't know. There's a lot in New Jersey's history, it's hard to say. But certainly, there's no question whatsoever, it's had a huge impact. And it's not just the impact that it's had, but the policy behind it and the controversy surrounding it. A lot of people don't understand the reason for the policy or the impacts of the policy, and more importantly, the future impacts of the policy. This is not just a history lesson. This is past, present, and future. So, and this is the one that we have the least control over. How did this happen? How did we have this policy? How did it get formulated? It started with the Mount Laurel court decisions. This is a case where policy was established by the courts. It wasn't established by the legislature or the governor. It was established by the courts. New Jersey Supreme Court, quote, acknowledging that it's complex, controversial, and of great importance. It started with Mount Laurel Township. Mount Laurel Township is in South Jersey. It is outside of Camden. It's a suburban town. And back in the 60s, Mount Laurel Township did not have any zoning that allowed for garden apartments. It required single-family housing lots at least half an acre in size. There wasn't any zoning that permitted apartments or townhouses. A group of residents sought a zoning change. They asked their governing body to change the zoning so that they could afford to live in town in a garden apartment. After a number of meetings and hearings and discussions, the town of Mount Laurel rejected the change. And the quote is pretty telling. It says, if you people can't afford to live in our town, then you'll just have to leave. These were people who already lived in town. They wanted to stay in town. The town rejected it. Well, they went an appeal up to the courts, and it went through the whole court system. Went first to Superior Court, then to the Appellate Division, then to the Supreme Court. The result is what's known today as the first Mount Laurel Court decision. And I've put a number of quotes of the Supreme Court in its decision. The court saw that there was a need for affordable housing. They framed the legal question this way. whether a developing municipality like Mount Laurel may make it physically and economically impossible to provide low and moderate income housing for the various categories of persons who need and want it, and thereby exclude such people from living within its confines. And they were looking specifically at land use regulation. They were not looking at other factors like market factors, like there's a whole host of issues one could look at as to why housing is expensive and what's driving that. What was in their mind was the zoning that Mount Laurel Township had, and the Mount Laurel Township refused to change. But not only did they look at Mount Laurel zoning, they expanded it beyond the boundaries of Mount Laurel. They said the issue here is not confined to Mount Laurel. The same question arises with respect to any number of other municipalities of sizable land area outside the central cities and older built-up suburbs. And they concluded that every such municipality must, by its land use regulations, that's zoning, presumptively make realistically possible an appropriate variety and choice of housing, not only within its town, but within its region. We feel that every municipality therein must bear its fair share of the regional burden. So the court, to recap in the Mount Laurel decision, said that Mount Laurel's zoning was discriminatory. It discriminated against the poor. And they saw in that New Jersey's Constitution prohibits discrimination. So they framed this issue as a constitutional issue, and to violate it was a constitutional violation. So from that, they then took a major leap to say that the Constitution requires that you affirmatively zone. Now, you will not find in New Jersey's Constitution anything that says zoning and affordable housing or zoning and discrimination. This is why this decision was so controversial, because the court took a basic principle that I think everybody can agree on, the issue of discrimination, and extended it into an area it had never gone before, and that is that zoning could be discriminatory. One can talk about discrimination in many things, in hiring practices, discrimination in one's access to equal rights, and in many other ways. But no one had ever talked about it in zoning terms before. And the court took Mount Laurel zoning and made a cause célèbre out of it and said, this too is discrimination. And they said you cannot zone in a manner that's discriminatory. That has huge ramifications in finding it constitutional, because as you know, the only way to change a constitutional issue, constitutional thing, is by changing the Constitution. If you find that a law is flawed, you just change the law. It's a lot easier to change the law than it is to change the Constitution. To change the Constitution, first of all, you need supermajorities, and the whole process is designed for stability reasons to make it difficult to change the Constitution. So by framing it in constitutional terms, the court in Mount Laurel really carved this in stone, if you will, and said, you can't change the law to get away with this. You have to, if you're going to change this, the state of New Jersey as a whole has to agree to it as by way of a constitutional amendment. Well, what happened? Not much. Which led to the second Mount Laurel court decision. 8 years later, the court said Mount Laurel remains afflicted with a blatantly exclusionary ordinance. And they also went on to say Mount Laurel is not alone. We believe that there is widespread non-compliance with the constitutional mandate of our original opinion. And so the court was angry. The court said, you're not paying attention. We're going to clarify our decision. We're going to strengthen it. And we're making it easier to implement it. And they imposed a number of rules that affected subsequent policy. One of those rules was to create a formula that calculated what the obligation is, because towns and developers and advocates have been fighting over how do we calculate our obligation? What are the rules for that? Well, they hadn't really done a good job in the first case in doing that, so now they clarified it, and they said, okay, we're going to calculate the obligation, we're going to look at the supply of affordable housing, we're going to look at the need for affordable housing. To the extent that the need is greater than the supply, we're going to allocate the deficit to all the towns in the state of New Jersey. And they came up with some ways of doing that and basically said you're going to have to follow this. They also imposed significantly what's called today builder's remedy. What is builder's remedy? Builder's remedy is essentially a shortcut whereby a developer or a builder can appeal to court on making the claim that a municipality has not complied with its constitutional obligation, and basically the burden will be on the municipality at that point in time to prove that it has complied. Before, normally when you go to court, the burden is on the plaintiff to prove that somebody has done something wrong. In the case of a builder's remedy situation, however, that burden shifts. It now becomes the burden on the town to prove that it has complied, not the burden on the builder. Yes, he has to make a preliminary case, but the only way a town would be protected from a builder's remedy claim would be if it had a court ruling saying, yes, you are compliant. So now we created what's called a builder's remedy situation, and that was meant as more of an enforcement tool, something as a threat to towns that felt that they could avoid this by making it easier for developers or builders to take them to court. In between Mount Laurel 1 and Mount Laurel 2, Hanover Township got involved in Mount Laurel litigation. And this was called the Morris County Fair Housing Litigation. There were 17 municipalities, including Hanover Township, that were part of that litigation. This was in the late 70s, early 80s. The net result of that litigation, I'm not going to get into the details of it, it went on for years, was that Hanover was given an obligation of 250 affordable housing units. The result that Hanover did to provide zoning for those 250 affordable units was the RM zone. And there were 5 locations in the RM zone, all of which have been developed and are known today as Eden Mill Village, Oak Ridge, Sunrise at Hanover, Hanover Hills, and Sterling Park. The total housing units in those 5 developments is 1,144. You might ask, well, wait a minute, I thought it was 250, not 1,144. How did we get that many? Well, here's the problem. No developer is going to build affordable housing unit only. They're going to lose money doing so. So the court said, in order to get developers to provide incentive to developers, you have to give them what's called a compensatory benefit. And that is, you have to compensate them for their loss in building affordable units. And by doing so, we're going to say that you have to give them higher density than they would otherwise be able to have. So they said you can force a builder to build 20 or so % of the total number as affordable units, but then he's able to build 80% market rate housing. And that's how we got to that number, was because no builder builds 100% affordable housing, not with huge government subsidies. So most, not all, but most multifamily housing that's built for affordable housing reasons is what's called inclusionary development. And that inclusionary development has a percentage as affordable, but the greater percentage is market rate housing. So you can see how 250 units resulted in 1,144 units in Hanover Township. Remember I said before there's 1,800 today? Well, just from this litigation, 1,144 units came out of that litigation. Again, following from the Mount Laurel decision. Well, as you can imagine, by this time, the state was in an uproar over this. There have been 2 Supreme Court decisions Numerous municipalities had been sued. Untold dollars had been spent on legal fees, on planning fees, on other experts, doing studies, trying to calculate obligations, and so forth. And something had to be done. Well, something was done. It was called the Fair Housing Act. Finally, 10 years after the original Mount Laurel decision, the state of New Jersey stepped up to the plate and passed legislation. It's called the Fair Housing Act. Supreme Court commenting on it here on the screen. Not ordinary legislation. It's a difficult constitutional, legal, and social issue providing suitable housing. What did the Act do? The Act set forth the required components of a municipal housing plan. It also created what's called Council on Affordable Housing. We've all heard it. It's called COAH. Some people call it Curse on All Humanity, but it stands for Council on Affordable Housing. And this was intended to provide a more orderly process than had been before. Keep in mind, it was a constitutional obligation, so the legislature didn't have the freedom to deviate from the Supreme Court's decision. All it could do was put it into law so that now, instead of dealing with the court system and doing it by a litigation, you do it by a state-mandated process, which was simpler, more straightforward, and less contentious. Let's talk a little bit about COAH, the Council on Affordable Housing. In the Fair Housing Act, they created a state agency called the Council on Affordable Housing. The council consists of a board, much like our planning board, that actually does the voting and does the decision-making and basically is the functioning body that operates. They're also supported by a working staff, professional staff, an executive director and staff that advises them, does a lot of the research, compiles it, and then provides it to the council. Also, the staff reviews municipal housing plans and offers them to the council, which then has to decide whether to approve those plans or not. COAH's duties, I'll put them on the screen here. They determine municipal housing obligations. It's no longer done by the courts. Under the Fair Housing Act, they adopt the rules for preparing housing plans and for administering those plans. There's a lot of rules. I won't go into a lot of detail, but for example, they determine what's affordable mean, what price is an affordable price. They determine what kind of density you have to give a developer in order to make it affordable, what kind of set-asides of affordable units you can impose upon a developer, a number of things, how many rental units you have to have, how many age-restricted units you can have in your housing plan. There's a whole host of rules that COAH adopts. They also review your plans once you've prepared a plan for compliance with the rules. So instead of a court now doing it, COAH is supposed to do this under the Fair Housing Act. They also mediate affordable housing disputes. So now instead of a builder going to the court to challenge a town, they would go to COAH to do it. And then COAH also monitors and provides technical assistance to municipalities, to builders, to housing advocates. So that was the big nut behind the Fair Housing Act, was creating a state agency that was going to make life easier for everybody while still complying with the court's decision, so that you could do this by an administrative process versus a legal process. Now, one of the defining features of COAH is what's called rounds. And rounds are time periods within which obligations are assigned and addressed. And the idea behind rounds is that the obligations change over time. That you may establish in 1985 that the obligations are this, but what happens down the road once more housing gets built, once population grows, what's the obligation then? So COAH recognized early on, and the Fair Housing Act recognized early on, that affordable housing need changes over time. And that needs to be recalculated over time. So they came up with the concept of rounds. And the first round started in 1987 and ran for 6 years through 1993. Hanover Township's response for that first round was addressed by its court imposed obligation of 250 units, that 1144 total units that we just talked about a few minutes ago. Then in the second round, which began in 1994 and went through 1999, COAH assigned and Hanover addressed a 366 unit obligation. Now I need to explain that that 366 unit includes the 250 units from the first round. It's not a totally new number. So you can subtract 250 from the 366 and you can see a net obligation increase of 116 affordable units. And Hanover Township addressed that and got COAH approval of its housing plan and its zoning to address that obligation. The third round started in 2000. We are in today this third round. You'll notice a different time period. 2000 to 2025, 25-year period instead of a 6-year period. Why the long period? There was a long story behind that. It started this way. COAH wanted to synchronize its rounds with the census data. The 2000 census data doesn't come out until 2003, 2004, so COAH wouldn't have that data until then to calculate the obligation, because it uses a lot of that data in calculating housing production, population change, incomes, and so forth. So COAH didn't release third round rules and obligations until 2004. So there was like a 4-year period from 2000 to 2004 when no municipality knew what its obligation was. And when they imposed it in 2004, it was retroactive to 2000. So it put towns right off the bat behind the 8 ball. But other things happened. They were proposing at the time that it would be a 10-year obligation instead of 6. And now we're looking at 25 years. You'll see a quote here, which was prophetic, from the COAH the Supreme Court's second Mount Laurel decision. It says, "We've learned from experience that unless a strong judicial hand is used, Mount Laurel will not result in housing," I mean the Mount Laurel Doctrine, "but in paper, process, witnesses, trials, and appeals." In a nutshell, that kind of describes the third round. You see here on the screen, I've said during the third round, COAH's rules, the municipal obligations, and COAH itself have been the subject of litigation and controversy. There's a whole lot going into that. Suffice to say, and I've got a whole lot if you want the details, but COAH, when it adopted its rules, came up with a new method of calculating the obligation. It's called growth share. The idea was as a town grows, its affordable housing obligation grows. As more jobs are created in a town, more people working those jobs are going to need affordable housing. As a town's housing stock grows, more people are going to need affordable housing. So they took jobs and housing and they said as a town develops, it's going to have to, along with that development, provide affordable housing. So that was challenged. It went to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said, no, that's not what the Fair Housing Act says to calculate it that way. If the state wants to change the Fair Housing Act, they can, but until they do, you're stuck with the way the Fair Housing Act says to calculate the obligation. So they struck that down. They also struck down some other rules. COAH adopted amended rules. The court struck those down too. 2 or 3 times this happened. Each time the Supreme Court struck down COAH's amended rules and said, no, you're not being compliant with the Fair Housing Act. Governor Christie, at one point, tried to eliminate COAH and replace it with a department in the Department of Community Affairs. That was appealed to court. The Supreme Court said you can't get rid of COAH. That was established by the Fair Housing Act. It did not give you the authority to eliminate that agency. Only the legislature can eliminate that agency. So again, the court put on the legislature, said you created this, you can't now change it without a legislative amendment. Suffice to say, a whole lot of litigation, a whole lot of reversals, a whole lot of controversy. Meanwhile, towns were expected to comply with these obligations. Hanover Township is in its 5th version of its housing plan during the third round. There may be a sixth. I don't know. We're still not out of it yet. So there was a whole lot of wheel spinning, a whole lot of time and money spent for naught during the third round because of the controversy that surrounded the whole process. In 2015, the Supreme Court finally had enough, and they determined that COAH was, their words were moribund, and had repeatedly failed to adopt valid third round rules. And again, the quotes on the screen kind of say it all. We are in the exceptional situation in which the administrative process has become non-functioning. Why did they say that? It wasn't because the governor tried to get rid of COAH. The final straw was when COAH tried to adopt revised rules in accordance with the court's directive, and they tied. It was a 3-3 vote. They couldn't adopt it without a majority vote. So it just sat there. Finally, it went to court, and the court asked COAH, why aren't you trying to resolve the deadlock to adopt the new rules? COAH said to the court, we haven't met, we have no plans to meet, we have not instructed staff to provide documentation to answer questions or resolve issues. But basically, COAH said to the Supreme Court of New Jersey, we're done. At which point, the court said, okay, you are done. We're not saying you can't come back alive again, but for now, we're taking over. That's where we stand today. And the court said, we conclude that towns must subject themselves to judicial review. Deja vu all over again. Just like Mount Laurel, just like Mount Laurel 2, the administrative process had failed, and the court felt it had to step in to get something done. So what is the current situation? Municipalities have to go back to court to get approval of their housing plans. Otherwise, that builder's remedy thing is still out there. The court process involves what's called interveners. What are interveners? It's not a builder's remedy situation because the court ruled that a town isn't subject to builder's remedy until it's been decided they haven't complied. Well, have they or haven't they complied? No one knows yet. But the court did allow these parties called interveners to be involved in the process of determining whether towns comply. And interveners are typically developers, but they're also housing advocates. And there are various housing advocates in New Jersey. One is called the Fair Share Housing Center. And they've been one of the main advocates in New Jersey of advocating for the needs of the low and moderate income households. Those parties are party to all of the documents that go into court, all of the motions and all of the pleadings before the court. They get to present their side of the argument as well. And that's what the Supreme Court ruled had to happen. Courts have not yet determined municipal affordable housing obligations. This has been on 18 years now in the third round, where how to calculate those obligations, even though the Fair Housing Act says how to calculate the obligations, it does so in broad terms. It doesn't get down into the nitty-gritty. It doesn't define the data sources to be used. It doesn't interpret the data. And so there's been this unending debate over what municipal obligations are. And the courts have to make that final determination on what the obligations are. You can see in the fourth bullet on this page two different obligation calculations for Hanover Township. One is 639 by a firm called eConsult. eConsult is a consultant hired by a consortium of municipalities. Over 200 municipalities hired eConsult to come up with calculations. And these calculations are voluminous. There's like 100 pages or more of detailed spreadsheets and calculations that are involved in making this calculation. Meanwhile, the Fair Share Housing Center hired an individual, David Kinsey, to come up with a calculation. He said Hanover Township's obligation is $1,931. That's over 3 times what eConsult says. The same is true in many municipalities. There's wide divergence in the obligation in most municipalities. Guess what? Fair Share is usually higher than eConsult. Big surprise. But these are affordable units. And again, these include the prior two rounds. Hanover Township, as of this date, has satisfied e-consult calculation. But again, the court has yet to bless e-consult calculation. We don't know what the court is going to do. The court has hired a third expert to give his opinion on how the calculations are to be made. Still, that's up in the air as we speak today. But you can see that, again, remember how 250 units of housing resulted in 1,144 units of construction? With these kind of numbers, you can imagine the impact and the number of units that would have to be built. So it's a significant issue. If the court were to rule, for example, on the Kinsey number, using the same idea of one affordable unit for every 4 market rate units, meaning 20% affordable, you'd have to build over 7,000 housing units in Hanover Township to meet that 1931. Counting what we've already built, mind you. But still, counting what we've already built, that would be over 5,000 housing units in Hanover Township, which would be as many housing units as we already have in town, but with a lot less land. And the only way you can even build much of it at all is through multifamily housing. So you can see the situation is one where what does the future hold? My conclusions are on the screen and following the screen. One is that, to recap, there are a number of demographic and economic factors at play here. There is a market demand. Builders don't build multifamily housing unless it sells or rents. Not much anyway. There is a demand out there, even for expensive multifamily housing. It's not just because people can't afford single family. People want to live in these $700,000, $800,000 townhouses. So there will be a market demand, even if there wasn't Mount Laurel. There would be pressure. However, the town's ability to refuse multifamily housing is greatly constrained by the Mount Laurel doctrine. And again, because it's constitutional, the New Jersey legislature cannot eliminate it. The governor cannot eliminate it. The only thing that can change it is a constitutional amendment. The court, in its very earliest ruling, said that the need and the burden is greatest in developing suburban municipalities. In the urban municipalities, the court said they already have more than their fair share of affordable housing. Most of multifamily housing and most low-cost multifamily housing and most low-income households live in urban areas. They said the problem is that there's not an adequate distribution of it. As suburbs develop, they're going to need more affordable housing. That's where the jobs are. They need to build homes. So towns like Hanover and other towns in Morris County get hit with very high obligations. We've seen over time that the obligations increase. Hanover's went from 250 to 366 to, even using the conservative calculation of e-consult, over 600. So the obligations don't stay flat, they go up. And I've seen this in town after town after town. It's not just Hanover Township. Big surprise here, a lot of towns are going to struggle with these obligations. Regardless of what the number is, the number is going to be a significant number. And keep in mind, it's just the third round. There'll be a fourth round in 2026. In 8 years from now, there'll be a fourth round with different obligations. This final round of obligations is just to give you a couple quotes. Bergen and Passaic County Assemblywoman Holly Shapisi said in July 2017, if built, the number of new homes alone would far exceed all the homes in the entire borough of Manhattan. In Somerset County, Montgomery Township mayor said that the flux of multifamily housing would ruin the rural character of the area and would, quote, overwhelm the township's infrastructure, greatly increase property taxes, and burden the school system, and negatively impact the quality of life in the township. So it's a situation that is of great importance, but right now it's in a state where we're pretty much held prisoner by the court process. Why doesn't the governor and the legislature do something? The court itself has said that if the legislature wants to revise how affordable housing obligations are calculated, it can do so. Why doesn't the governor get COAH working again so that towns don't have to go through this legal process that's expensive and time-consuming and very contentious? Recently, Governor Murphy indicated he's going to let the court process play out. So right now we have the legislature and the governor basically on the sidelines in this. So what to do? At this point in time, until things change, we have to make the best of it. And what do I mean by making the best of it? Well, I think to the extent that we can have a role in this process is to, if we are forced to do multifamily housing, we should do it in a way and in locations that make the most sense, not just anywhere. If we have to do multifamily housing, do it in a location where maybe helps the retail base of the town. Do it in a location that has the least impact to the traffic, the street system. Do it in locations that are more likely to survive over time and prosper over time. If you put multifamily housing in a lousy location where people are not going to want to live, all you're going to find in the future is a failed situation there that no one wants. But if you put housing in a location that people want to live, then eventually there's these booms and busts. Just like with the office market in the 1980s, it was overbuilt, there was a crash, you ended up with empty office buildings. Guess which ones are surviving? The ones that are in the best locations, the ones that are the prime office locations and the prime office layouts and everything like that. Those are the ones that survive. I would say the same thing on multifamily housing. If we do it right, that will survive and not be an empty shell that someone has to tear down later or gets just doesn't get maintained, becomes an empty thing. So it's a situation not of our making. It's a situation that's both due to economic and demographic forces as well as state policy that's really driving the bus on this situation. And it's a situation that all of us could wish, and I wish, that they would find more reasonable approaches to doing this than what we're dealing with at the moment, but we're stuck with what we're stuck with. And so, given that we're stuck with it at the moment, we should do the best we can with it. And that's all I have to say. I'd like to open it up for questions and any discussion. Yes, sir.
How many years has this been around? Has a constitutional amendment ever been proposed to...
I know when Governor Christie came into office that he had a policy group that had suggested a constitutional amendment, but it never went anywhere. My suspicion is that New Jersey is... I've even read that the urban areas favor the policy that the courts have established, whereas you can guess the suburban and rural areas are opposed. And I just suspect the state is divided on the issue, and that's why there wasn't a constitutional amendment put forward by one party or the other, because they didn't feel it would have a chance. I don't know, but that's just my impression.
I can't believe in essence what you're saying is that they're going for the urbanization of New Jersey suburbs. Basically,
that is, yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say that they intended that as the direct result, but that's certainly the net effect in a lot of areas. Yeah, you were first.
Has anybody ever argued the point recently that this all started with down rural and everybody was going to the suburbs and everybody was abandoning the cities? And where we are now, as you said, it's the opposite. You look at Hudson County, those towns in the river, even Newark to a certain extent, transit village cities. So now the more desirable locations, and many ways, at least with the millennials and the seniors, are in urban areas. So the intent back then was to kind of, share the promised land with those that couldn't afford it, but now you have a reverse situation. So shouldn't that ease the burden?
And I think it would, at some point it would, because the way it's calculated, what they do is they look at housing supply and housing demand. Affordable housing supply and affordable housing demand. Inevitably, the demand exceeds the supply. All right. So they then say, how do we allocate this deficit in supply? They allocate it to 565 municipalities using a formula of they look at population growth, job growth. They look at the income of the residents of the towns and in the region. And they look at, so in those urban areas that are gentrifying, like Jersey City and other areas that you've seen, all that high-density housing built along the Hudson River, that's usually high-income housing. Yes, that's having an effect, but there's still a lot of catch-up to be done. So there's still, although there's a lot of wealth in there, there's also still a lot of poverty in those urban areas, and it's not been enough to compensate to shift the allocation of the obligation back to the urban areas. A lot of people have argued that's where the obligation would be best served. That's where the poor live. That's where a lot of the poor work. They used to have, they abolished that in the 80s, what's called a regional contribution agreement, whereby suburban towns could transfer a portion of their obligation to these urban areas. In fact, we took advantage of that as part of our second round plan by transferring some of our obligation to the city of Orange. The court in the 2000s, it was the legislature, removed that as an option, saying it was discriminatory, it was just fostering exclusionary practices by municipalities. So they took it away entirely. They never allowed you to transfer all of it. You could only transfer, I think, 25% of your obligation. That was something, and it was, a lot of towns argued that's helping urban areas in a lot of ways, and even arguing that the state plan, which says, let's focus development in urban centers instead of the sprawl development pattern that we have. It's more cost efficient, it's more sustainable over time. That much of COAH's policy, or the court's policy, is contrary to the state plan. So believe me, there's been a lot of arguments made that more of a burden should be borne by urban municipalities for a lot of reasons. But so far, that's not been.
Look at the jobs that artists, those work, Amazon, New Jersey, those only work that so there's a movement of jobs to the city, and they have the infrastructure.
Yes.
So I would think
Yes.
a good lawyer.
Believe me, there's been a lot of good lawyers involved in this litigation and have made those very same arguments. So far, I won't say they've fallen on deaf ears, but it has not been compelling enough to change the court's mind on that. Yes, you.
Question regarding Hanover Township. Right now, we know there's a development going on on Whippany Road, and the corner of Whippany Road and Parsippany Park Avenue.
Whippany and Park,
where
yes.
the Presbyterian Church was. Other than that, are there any other developments before the township that would deal with Mount Laurel or
There's one before the Board of Adjustment today on Parsippany Road, near its intersection with Whippany Road. They're seeking to build 141, I think, units of housing with some affordable units in it.
next to where the post office?
Near the Quick Check. Yeah, between the post office and the Quick Check. That's the only one I think that's currently before the town.
I heard about that. I didn't know if there was anything else.
There are interveners in our Mount Laurel court appeal. Basically, our Mount Laurel court, we're trying to prove to the court that we've satisfied our obligation. We provided the court with our calculation of the calculation via e-consult. The interveners are arguing that we haven't because their obligation is higher than what e-consult says. Those interveners include housing developers. One of the interveners is the same party that's before the Board of Adjustment. that was talked about, but there are others as well. That if they get their way, the town would be obligated to rezone their properties for more multifamily housing.
Isn't that a flood zone, that particular area right along the river
Where?
there? Well, where the library is, where the post office is.
Yes,
Isn't
there
that
is some flood zone in that area, but there is a substantial upland portion that's not. That's, there's an old industrial building
Yes.
on that site today. But the back portion is flood zone, but not the front portion. So I think you were next. Yes.
So does Hanover Township, do we have a stand on whether we'd rather have COA operating or it falling back to the courts?
I think, I can't speak for the town as a whole. I can only speak for myself. I don't know that question's ever been put. My own personal opinion is it would be better working with COA than with the courts. It would be less contentious.
Wasn't Christie the one that tried to kill COA?
COA tried to kill COA, yes. Well, Governor Christie
He didn't
opposed the
appoint
whole
whoever-
policy that the courts had established in Mount Laurel. And it wasn't, I don't think it was COA specifically, because even the governor proposed to replace COA with some other entity in the government, because he knew he couldn't completely eliminate. His own advisors suggested that a constitutional amendment would be the only way of changing the policy. My own experience is that working with COA was a lot easier and a lot more straightforward than working through the court system.
Less expensive too, I would think.
It's less expensive, a lot less legal fees involved. In addition, the court is not well suited to the technicalities of this, where COA was. It had people that were dedicated just to this issue. The court deals with a whole range of issues and is relatively, the court has to hire outside experts to advise it on this, because it doesn't know a lot of this stuff that in calculation of thing, looking at all the data and coming up with obligations and so forth. So it's not just the legal fees, but the town has to pay, at least share in the cost of paying for these experts that are advising the court as well. So when we went through COA, it was a lot more straightforward, and it was cheaper, and it was faster. So, I would vote for COA any day than working through the court system, but obviously COA has, by the way, not met in the last 2 years. I think you are the back.
Has they ever done like an economical impact study as far as like what the affordable housing does to a township, as far as like the rateables, you can't collect as much as you would for a full price
It varies.
house?
It varies. The thing that is probably the most contentious is the school children.
They're not paying the same rate.
Various studies have shown anywhere from one public school child for every 5 to 10 units. So, in other words, if you had 100 units of apartment housing, various studies have shown that you would get anywhere from 10 to 20 school kids out of those 100 units. We did a study in Hanover Township a number of years ago through the Board of Education. We said, how many of your students are coming from these apartments? And what we came up with, one public school child for every 9 multifamily units in Hanover Township. That was market rate housing. Affordable housing was slightly higher because affordable housing has to have more bedrooms in it. But it was, so understand that of your municipal tax bill, probably close to 2/3 is Board of Education costs. So when you look at the fiscal impact of multifamily housing, school is naturally the number one issue. And so it depends in part upon the value of the housing and how many school children. That's the number one driver of the fiscal impact of multifamily housing. I've recently was involved in Ridgewood, where a number of studies were done, and they found that the fiscal benefit, there would actually be a fiscal benefit in Ridgewood's situation based upon the cost of the house. And it depends on the rental. Look at the market rate units. if you're talking about $700,000 townhouses, you're generally getting a positive fiscal benefit. If you're talking about $200,000 homes with 2 school kids, you're talking about a hit. All right. So really, the factors are how many bedrooms and what level of housing is the market rate housing to understand what the fiscal impact is going to be. If you have high value market rate housing, you may actually not have a negative fiscal impact. You may have a positive fiscal impact. The bigger questions are, does your school have space to accommodate the student? Never mind the tax impact, but can you actually fit them in the school? And then there's the demand for other services. But school is the big one. And do you have room to expand the schools? Fortunately, we've been seeing a drop in the school population in recent years. So it's not as dire as it might have been if, for example, school populations were continuing to decline and we had a shortage of space. And that's what Ridgewood was facing, was regardless of the tax impact, their schools were at capacity and they were struggling, and they don't have room. Being a Bergen County town, they didn't have the room like Hanover does maybe to build an addition to a school to add classrooms. So it's a complicated issue, the fiscal impact, but it varies.
How many units did you say was from the near the post office?
141 is what's proposed. That is, again, just proposed.
And some of those will be like
A portion, like 15 to 20% of those would be affordable.
I know the first affordable housing that were built, it's probably coming up to close to 20, 25 years. Isn't there something that they get off the...
Yes, there's a 30-year deed restriction.
30 years?
Yes.
Okay, and after the 30 years, then they become fair
Then
market?
they become market value housing.
So then that would be taken off our obligation. They wouldn't be considered our obligation.
Well, no. Once you provided the opportunity,
Okay.
and it was, you don't ever lose that obligation.
Okay.
What you can do is buy some of those back and renew that 30-year obligation.
Okay.
So, for example, if the town were to buy that unit, sell it back again to somebody with a deed restriction on the affordable housing,
Okay.
you could get credit a second time for the same unit.
Okay, gotcha.
Right? But having done it the first time, you don't ever lose the credit for having done it.
Okay.
So keep in mind, these obligations are cumulative. So the third round includes the first 2 rounds obligations plus. So we've satisfied those 250 units from our first round. We'll never lose credit for that.
Okay.
And the 366 units for the second round will never lose credit for that, even after they become market rate units. Yes, Terry.
Anytime we put in multifamily housing zoning in our plan for the town, that has to be approved by the
No.
state?
No. What the state requires is that we have a plan, and that plan calls for zoning to meet whatever the obligation is.
So,
It doesn't mean we can't do multifamily housing that's not part of the plan. We can. But we have to have a plan that meets at least what our obligation is for affordable.
so it has nothing to do with density, like as far as like having 8 rental units or whatever per acre as opposed to 11.
Well, the way it's in COAH's rules, COAH basically says that to be enough of a remember that word, compensatory benefit? They say in this part of the state that has to be at least 8 units to the acre to do that. All right, we could make it higher, and they also say in the rules, in certain situations, they can require a higher density if it's needed to be a compensatory benefit. Here's a situation that could face the town. If we're in a town that had an obligation, and you said you did everything at 8 units per acre, all right? If the court felt that a higher density would work in a situation, meaning it wouldn't unduly burden the street system, the school system, it wouldn't negatively affect the surrounding properties, the court could mandate higher than 8 units per acre. However, once you get to a certain point where you've done everything you can, they have a thing called a vacant land adjustment. And that's basically where you say to the court, court, we've done everything we can, and there's a whole process involved. We don't have any more land that's suitable for housing. We'd like a vacant land adjustment. Basically, what happens at that point in time, the court says, okay, you've done everything you can. They don't ever get rid of your obligation. So if a new opportunity comes up in the future, the court can direct you to zone that for housing. But you can get at least temporary relief by a vacant land adjustment if you've basically zoned everything you can that's reasonably zoned. Obviously, you don't want to put multifamily housing in the middle of an industrial zone type of situation. But if you've put everywhere that multifamily housing is appropriate to go, and you still haven't met your obligation, they can give you what's called a vacant land adjustment.
So it doesn't ever involve anything with eminent domain?
Not, it could theoretically, but again, the town isn't required to build housing. It's only required to create a reasonable opportunity for someone to build it. So typically that means zoning it in a way that a builder could build it and make money doing it.
And the part about the builder has to benefit from it, what's the percentage of profit for that?
It depends. I mean, there's a lot
How
of
do they come
factors
up
that
with
go
that?
into that. I mean, they calculate that on a hypothetical scenario. Like I could argue 8 units per acre is going to be a windfall in one situation. It may not be enough in another situation. If there's, for example, if there's a lot of demolition costs, let's say there's cleanup costs from contamination that's involved. Let's say there's a whole lot of earth moving or an extension of utilities, building streets and so forth to provide access. To do that, well, now the builder's costs are higher. He may need a higher density to make it financially feasible. Whereas in some situations where he's got a clean farm field and you got it for a song and a dance, he may not need 8 units per acre to make it profitable at all. But they came up with a generic 8 units per acre based upon studies of land values, housing construction costs, and that sort of thing.
What's their profit margin that they're shooting for?
Those are usually held kind of secret. I've seen numbers thrown out of 15 to 20% profit margins, but those don't apply in all cases. Any more questions?
How many of our units have to be rental and how many have to be condos that they buy?
25% of our obligation has to be rental. At least 25%.
45 you said?
25.
Oh, 25.
Yeah. 40. Yes.
I have a question. How this requirement to construct and to supposedly increase multifamily units per acre, how does that reconcile with the public's desire for space as well as the population's needs for access to employment? I mean, I see a lot of disconnects here where, I mean, COAH may have started with the best of intentions, but I think it should be replaced with something far, far better and much more inclusive. You can't just build a place of domicile. At the same time, you have to also consider access to, to places of employment, where to put those places of employment. I'll give you a case in point. I commute 45 miles to my job. And this corporate park was put in the most idiotic places, right in the middle of a residential area. And you have to go on local roads to get to it. I mean, it should have never been put there. It should have been put next to a highway. Okay? Of course, this decision was made. This isn't the Rockland corporate campus up by the Rockland State Board State. Obviously, this decision was made eons ago. But as an example of a disconnect, you know what I mean?
I could tell you from my reading of the court decision, and believe me, I hear you 100%, that sometimes I've called it the affordable housing tail wagging the planning dog. And by that I mean sometimes all the normal rules of good planning go out the window sometimes when we're dealing with affordable housing policy, where towns have been mandated to zone certain locations for affordable housing that I would say, as a planner, I don't think that's good planning. So I believe, I'm totally sensitive to what you're saying, A couple things. First of all, the rules do allow you to exclude a certain amount of land. I think it's 3% for open space of your total acreage for open space, so that even if it's not currently open space, it can be, if you're planning to use it for open space in the future, or if it's already being used for open space, you can exclude that. You don't have to zone that for multifamily housing. But as to the broader question of all the factors of going into good planning and what about all these other needs for things and so forth, and why isn't it closer to the jobs? In the original Mount Laurel decision, the court framed it sort of like this, is that these are the developing areas of New Jersey, the suburbs, that they're seeing the population growth, they're seeing the job growth, they're seeing, and therefore that is where the jobs are, and that's where the housing should be. That was the court's reasoning behind that. Now, as another individual said a little earlier, that's not necessarily the case today, but the methodology in calculating the obligation, I believe, has taken that somewhat into account. Whether it's taken it 100% into account or fully into account, I don't know. Whether that's adequately being taken care of. We've argued, and others have argued, that the urban areas, the redevelopment for housing in urban areas would be a good thing. And yes, towns should have to bear some of the obligation, but if you were to go to Newark or Patterson today, for example, and look at their affordable housing obligation, zero. And the basic reason for that is that the courts have basically said, and the legislature has said, they already have enough of the poor, and therefore to impose more on them would just be ghettoizing the situation. By the way, let me just talk a little bit about what affordable means. Generally, when they talk about affordable housing, they mean low or moderate income. What is low or moderate income? In Morris County, for example, low income, a household of four, that would mean 2 parents and 2 children, low income could make up to $45,000 annually. Moderate income could make like $72,000 or $73,000 annually income. That would, so if you made less than that, you'd be eligible for affordable housing. So it's not somebody making, the very, very super poor, they're generally unable even to afford affordable housing. They can't get the mortgage, they can't keep the mortgage to buy the housing or to pay the rents. It's even beyond their means. So when we talk about lower moderate income housing, we're talking about housing that, for example, the $73,000 income a year is, well, it might be a school teacher, it might be a fireman, it might be somebody in the Department of Public Works who could afford that housing. It might be a senior who lives in town, who's now on a fixed income but has assets that would allow them to do that. So it's not necessarily all what we think of as poverty type housing. It's more for people who can't afford the extremely high prices of housing in New Jersey, who would like and need to live here and need to live somewhere near their jobs. So, but you're right, there is a whole lot of disconnect in this whole process, and that's part of the reason it's controversial. Is that, yes, everyone can agree that everyone should be able to buy or rent housing within their means. That, I think we can all agree on that. Implementing that is a whole different story, and a lot of people have criticized us that it's really shifted way too much towards that issue and ignored a lot of other issues. And I would join in that there's just situations where I just, I'll give you an example in Ridgewood. I was Ridgewood's planner for many years. Every round, Ridgewood received what I told you about a vacant land adjustment. Every round, its obligation went up. Even though the state approved their housing plan every time, even though the state approved time and time again the fact that they did not have land to meet the obligation, the state not only kept their old obligation, but added to it in future rounds. And I, just exasperated, I spoke to COAH, and I said to COAH staff, I said, why are you doing this? I mean, it's like, even Fair Share Housing Center, who's a housing advocate, said, we understand Ridgewood will never meet its obligation. Not in 100 years. But, so why give it to them if we're not going to meet it? It's like, is this a shell game? So there's a whole lot, believe me, there's a whole lot of controversy behind the methodology, behind the allocation, behind is this good planning or not. It's very controversial. No getting around that.
Well, then what's the penalty?
I'm sorry?
What's the penalty?
The court will basically strip a town of its zoning power and mandate and say, this is how you will, the court will dictate the zoning if you don't do it yourself. So while a lot of towns have been tempted to ignore the court, they run so at their own peril, because towns, although they may not like it, they're better off at least being involved in the process and having some say than no say.
Have they done that as any town?
Yes, there was a town, I don't know if it was Hudson County or Bourbon County, that the court stripped it of its zoning powers.
For how long?
Until basically the court mandated that they could technically throw someone in jail for failing to comply. I don't think that's ever been done, but they basically it was open season for developers. Say, developers, you have a site, we're going to tell the town to zone it for affordable housing. Unless it's totally ridiculous. Say, obviously, if the site was wetlands, they wouldn't say that. But if it was at all appropriate, even marginally, they would basically say, developer, you can do it. Anybody who refuses to give you a permit for this, tell us, we'll have them stripped with their job. It's.
In line with what she's saying, what administrative staff does the court have?
No, they basically hire experts, outside experts. They have what's called a court master, who's basically a planner. And they have, the court's using 2 experts right now. We have a court master, who's a planner like me, who's usually a specialist in housing matters. And then they have another guy who's calculating the obligations, who's more like a statistician. And he's also interpreting the Fair Housing Act and what it means. Because when the legislature writes these laws, believe me, they're not detailed. They're usually broad brush. And it's left to the courts to interpret the meaning of it. So they're interpreting it based upon what COAH did in the past, and should that now be carried forward in the future, and all that kind of debate. But the court does not have staff that's knowledgeable at all about this. They hire outside experts.
So in other words, that town's planning board, adjustment board, they have no say at all anymore.
I don't know if they would go that far to say that, but I think what they're basically saying is they could place a moratorium, for example, on development within a town to give, say that they would assign the court master the duty of coming up with a plan that satisfies their housing obligation. Once that was done, then the court would say, okay, we'll return your zoning power to you. As long as you follow this, you can now approve development applications. But until then, you can't.
It's probably analogous to when the state takes over the education system.
Yeah. Yes. And the court was very clear on this. It says this is a police power. And there's a famous quote in the courts that says the state created the municipality, it can undo the municipality. We have the zoning power from the state, and we have to follow the state's rules to keep that power. So even though we're, quote, home rule, it doesn't only go so far. Yes.
So if I understood, your bottom line was we have to accept the fact that we have affordable housing requirements, and we have to come up with the wisest way to deal with it.
Yes.
So what does that translate to in practice? Like,
Well,
where are the areas in town that would be smart for, to put high density housing?
Well, it's it is a situation where if you have a choice of where to put housing and not put housing, you want to put it. Obviously, if you put multifamily housing in a situation, it's going to be a terrific burden on the neighbors. For example, just the noise and activity. If you put it in the middle of a single-family neighborhood, it would be highly disruptive, unless there were adequate buffers. You want a place that's got good access. Like you could imagine if you had a 800-unit housing development, all that traffic coming out on a little street at a stop sign would be a problem. So you have to look at issues such as access. Is the land suitable? Is it, can you build it without creating all kinds of problems? No wetlands. Is it near shopping so that people could conveniently shop?
So where are those places in town?
Oh, in town? Oh, I have not, we're still debating over where, what the obligation is. Once we get an obligation, once the court says, this is your number, this is how many affordable units you have to satisfy, then we're going to explore. Like I said, we think, based upon our experts' calculation, that we've satisfied our obligation. If the court says we disagree with your expert, then we may have to do something. We may not.
We've had 366 of
No.
them, and even the consultant.
639 is what our consultant said for the third round, including the 250 and 366 from the prior two rounds. Keep in mind, that includes certain things like special bonus credits and things like that. But we've included things like group homes. We've included some other situations like the Leicester Senior Housing at the Metro West campus.
Oh, so
That's
the
part of our housing
The
plan.
600 something is, you're saying we've met.
Yes.
So the 366 up through the second round, and then on top of that, there's additional affordable housing that we've met.
We've met that obligation.
300, 400 some to get to 690.
639 is what eConsult said is our obligation. Kinsey said it's a lot higher. Until the court rules, we don't know. So we haven't really done the studies yet to determine where we have to do it, because we don't know if we're going to have to do it yet. So we're at this point in time, we're kind of in a holding pattern, waiting for the court to give us a number. If they gave us a number that we didn't meet, then we'd have to come up with zoning. We have some zoning in place that hasn't been developed as part of our housing plan. For example, Whippany Center, if you know where that is, Route 10 and Troy Hills Road, where the CVS is.
Right, yeah.
Okay, that has some affordable housing units zoned. It's not built, but it has some as part of our plan. But if all of that together still didn't meet the obligation, whatever the court determines that to be, then we'd have to come up with some additional locations. But we have not studied that yet, because we're hoping that the court will agree with eConsult and say that you've complied. But if we don't, then we'll look at that.
But in the fourth round, assuming there's a fourth round, would we anticipate that there might be additional? It's 7 years
That's been
away,
the trend. Each round, the number's gone up.
but it's 7 years away, so we'll worry about it in 7 years, as opposed to planning ahead.
Well, we have zoned for multifamily. We did, for example, housing on Horse Hill Road, off of Horse Hill Road, 78 units of affordable housing, even though we did not have a final obligation from the state. Right? So we have been proactive in trying to do this. But we're dealing with situations that we're doing huge numbers that we don't yet understand or know the impact to, because the court hasn't given us a number. So I would say that the town would take whatever action to feel was appropriate, knowing that there'll be a fifth round after the fourth round and a sixth round after the fifth round. At some point in time, Hanover is going to reach a state where it does not have more room. And at that point, Hanover Township is going to say to the court or to COAH, if COAH is functioning at the time, we've done all we can. We want a vacant land adjustment. All right? I'm saying that if our number is higher, we should still continue to consider multifamily housing in appropriate locations, in appropriate densities, where it supports the rest of the town. for example, like I said, sometimes multifamily housing in the right location can support retail. Route 10, we just did a major corridor study on Route 10. We've talked about trying to renovate retail on Route 10. That was part of the thinking behind the Whippany Village idea, was if we could get a center there of thriving retail, it may start to spread. And we might get fixing up of our Route 10 corridor for that type of development, where we get a better quality retail product out there. And so, but housing could help that, particularly if it's convenient to the retail and the retail is convenient to the housing. Why would you drive 5 miles to go to a restaurant if there's one right down the street, for example? So that's the idea. It doesn't always work in every situation, but that might be the type of situations where if we have to do multifamily housing, we put it in those types of locations, we get some benefits from it other than just satisfying the state's obligation. But we do something that we've talked about how seniors in town would like to retire in town and not leave, but they can't afford it. We might do that for that in those situations. So there's a number of positives that if we have to do multifamily housing, we try to satisfy those needs and put the housing in those locations that satisfy those needs. So, but as far as the specific sites, I can't, say at the moment.
Yeah, you were mentioning earlier about how a town, suburban town, would give an urban area money to take obligations on its hands.
Yes, regional contribution
Regional, what's it
agreement.
called again?
Regional contribution agreement, RCA.
Regional contribution. Okay. Can that also be done between suburban areas?
Yes, it can.
Can?
Yes.
Is that a possibility for
It's a possibility. It's unlikely because imagine if Parsippany wanted to give us some of its obligation. It's every suburban town is struggling with this, and because of the magnitude of the obligations to take on. Typically, what happens when a town takes on another town's obligations, it gets something for it. It either gets money or some other type of arrangement to compensate the town for taking that. Because there are impacts that have to be dealt with. So that can be done, but it's rare. I haven't seen it done much. And like I said, the state eliminated the RCA concept. But there are things that a town, like if you're next to another town, you could do an arrangement like that. What they didn't want to allow was transferring to the poor urban areas from the suburban areas.
So an example you gave about where for those 30-year restricted affordable homes that the town could buy and back, is that just hypothetical or some towns actually consider doing that?
Some are actually considering that, yes.
So financially that makes sense. And
Well, when I say financially it makes sense, typically what happens at the end of that 30-year period, the town gets 95% of the profit from the sale of the home. So let's say that the affordable home is worth $100,000, but the market price is $400,000.
so the delta of
So that $300,000 delta, the town gets 95% of that. So 95% of $300,000, and you can do the math, is going to be upper $200,000. The town could then use that money. It has to go into Affordable Housing Trust Fund. Could use that money to buy the unit. Now the units now cost $400,000, so the town still has to come up with the other $125,000 to buy that $400,000 unit, and then sell it at a $100,000 affordable price. The town still has to come up with the money to do that. But yes, that is a valid option for a town to do.
Can builders contribute to that fund?
We currently have a tax, not tax, it's a fee on developers. There's a 2.5% fee, that's the state-imposed fee on non-residential development, and 2.5% of the development net increase in property value on the development goes into our trust fund, and in residential it's 1 or 1.5% goes into that. Certain exclusions but generally that's how that works. That money is set aside for affordable housing purposes, and we can use some of that money for that purpose that you described.
It's an interesting concept, if you make that gap reasonable with developers.
Yeah, the question is the cost, because keep in mind, even with you getting 95% of it, you're having to come up with the balance. Now you get some money back when you sell it at an affordable price, but you're still at a net loss, all right? That money presumably would come out of that trust fund. It depends on the amount of the net loss and how many units we're talking. If you have an obligation for 700 units and you only have enough money to do that with 10 units, it's a drop in the bucket. But if you have enough money to do a lot more units, and yeah, you're getting basically credit without having to build any more houses.
Does the town become a landlord, so they have to...
No, you place it by a deed restriction.
Basically goes back.
It goes back to a deed restriction. The new owner is now the owner, but it's controlled by a deed. They cannot sell it at a market price. And we have a housing liaison in town that qualifies people who live in that housing to make sure they're not making more than they are allowed to make sure that not more people are living in it than are allowed to live in it. So we have a process that screens people for that. And if someone were to try to sell that in violation of that deed restriction, we have enforceable rights. So we can say, that was against the law, you can't do that.
And how long do the first units hit the 30 years?
Some of them are going to come up with that in the next year or two. Some not for another 10 years. But it's 30 years from when the CO was first issued. So you go back and find out when it was built, when it was occupied, and that's when the 30-year period
I guess
is.
the kicker is the town, if they're going to pursue that, they have to do it as they come off.
Yes, as they come off. Correct. Yes. And they're in the deed restriction now, the town has a right of first refusal on that.
Along that, if the person, instead of families that are living, that they're coming close to this, what happens to the families that are living in these units that may not want to?
They're not required to sell. They can continue to
They're not required to
live there.
sell. With their taxes and everything else, they can go up to market value?
I don't know. I'm not sure how that works.
You did a good job.
Get a gold star, you get a gold star.
That's a good question. I have to ask the assessor how he would handle that.
Especially because some of them will be coming up.
Yes, yes. No one's forced to sell or stop renting their unit if they want to continue to live there. They do have the right, however, to sell it or rent it out at a market price once the deed restriction runs out.
What are their obligations to the township when that restriction?
Well, basically, the 95% of the profit on the sale goes to the town,
But if they're not,
only on the initial sale. Subsequent sales, the town doesn't get
But if
anything.
they don't want to sell, whatever they would have come in and purchased at, say $150,000 in the unit.
Well, when they eventually do sell that, then they would realize the 5% that they would get versus the 95% that the town gets.
So the fact that you just said 95% is only the first time you only really do that once.
Yes.
And that's it.
That's right, because someone now buys that unit, let's say for $400,000, and let's say they keep it 10 years and it's worth $500,000, they sell it, the town doesn't get it all over again, because it's no longer an affordable unit, it's a market rate unit. So it's only when it goes from a transfer from an affordable unit to a market rate unit that kicks in.
You know, when someone is, say, in that bracket and they qualify to buy that affordable unit, what if they are in there for 10, 20 years,
Yes.
their income increases.
Yes. And there is no control on that. And I've argued for a long time there should be. I asked COAH, do your rules have anything to control that? In other words, a continuing eligibility screen. In other words, when I moved into the unit, I was eligible. Now, I've improved my situation. I make more money, that I'm eligible to do, under the current rules, you can stay there. All right? If the state was really concerned about housing affordable to people who couldn't otherwise do it, they would require an annual screening of your income to say, okay, you're now out of the thing. You have to say, move within 6 months or whatever it is to do that. So someone who really needs that housing can live there, but they don't. It's only the initial qualification.
Can a town on its own do this income screening?
I don't know the answer to that one. That's one I've not had to deal with. There's nothing in the rules that says they can or can't. So I'd have to get some opinion on that. All right, I hope you... I didn't say it would be fun, but I hope it was informative.